Narrator: They arrived in chains, terrified, indoctrinated, and heartbreakingly young. German prisoners of war, some barely 16 years old, shipped across the Atlantic to prison camps scattered across the American heartland. They had been told stories of what awaited them. Horror stories. Stories of torture, starvation, and execution. They were Hitler Youth. They were child soldiers. They were the enemy. But this is Texas. And what happened here in the dusty prison camps between 1943 and 1946 would shatter everything these boys believed about America, about their enemies, and ultimately about themselves. This is the story of how Hamburgers and Coca-Cola won a different kind of war. Title card: German child soldiers trembled in Texas prison camps. Transition: Train footage, barbed wire, guard towers. Narrator: Between 1943 and 1946, over 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. Texas alone housed approximately 50,000 POWs in over 70 camps scattered from the Panhandle to the Gulf Coast. Among them were thousands of teenagers, boys as young as 15 who had been swept up in the final, desperate years of the Third Reich. Some had volunteered, intoxicated by Nazi propaganda. Others had been conscripted as Germany's manpower dried up. Many had seen combat. All had been thoroughly indoctrinated. Narrator: 16-year-old Klaus Schneider arrived at Camp Swift, near Austin, in February 1945. He had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive. Years later, he recalled his arrival. Klaus, recorded interview, elderly voice: "I was so frightened I couldn't stop shaking. We'd been told the Americans would work us to death, that they'd torture us for information, that we'd be lucky to survive a week. I was 16 years old, thousands of miles from home, in a place I'd been taught to fear. I thought I was going to die." Narrator: Heinrich Weber, captured in North Africa at age 17, remembered similar terror. Heinrich, recorded interview: "The propaganda we'd absorbed wasn't just about the war. It was about Americans themselves. We'd been told they were barbaric, savage, interested only in money and violence, that they hated Germans with a passion that knew no bounds. When we arrived at the camp in West Texas, I expected hell." Transition: POW camp photographs, mess halls, barracks. Narrator: What these young Germans encountered was something their Nazi indoctrination had never prepared them for, something that would begin to crack the ideology that had consumed their adolescence. They were given hamburgers. It sounds almost absurd in retrospect, but that first meal, for many of these boys who had been eating scraps and rations, who had survived on ideology and fear, was a revelation. Klaus: "I remember that first meal so clearly. I was sitting in the mess hall, still expecting the worst, and they brought out this tray. A hamburger, fresh bread, vegetables, and this dark, sweet drink in a glass bottle. Coca-Cola, they called it. I just stared at it. I thought it was a trick, that they were going to poison us. But I was so hungry. I ate, and it was the best meal I'd had in years." Narrator: Under the Geneva Convention, America was obligated to feed POWs the same rations as its own soldiers. But this wasn't just about legal obligation. This was strategic psychology at its finest, though few recognized it at the time. Camp Commander Colonel Marcus Anderson at Camp Swift understood something fundamental about winning hearts and minds. Colonel Anderson, archival transcript: "These aren't hardened SS officers. They're kids. Scared kids who've been lied to their entire lives. The fastest way to break propaganda isn't through more propaganda. It's through simple, undeniable kindness. Feed them well. Treat them fairly. Let reality speak for itself." Transition: Wide shots of Texas landscape, camp activities. Narrator: What made the Texas camps particularly transformative was the culture clash. These German boys expected American brutality. What they got was Southern hospitality, albeit behind barbed wire. Camp guards, many of them Texans deemed too old or unfit for combat duty, brought an unexpected approach to POW management. They saw these young Germans not just as enemies, but as somebody's sons. Misguided, certainly. Dangerous, potentially. But salvageable. Narrator: Private First Class James Red Miller, a guard at Camp Swift who had been rejected for combat duty due to a childhood injury, later recalled. Red Miller, interview, most of us guards, we'd grown up during the Depression. We knew what it was like to be hungry, to be desperate. These German kids, especially the young ones, they reminded us of our own sons, our little brothers. Sure, they were Nazis, but they were also just scared teenagers. You could hate the ideology without hating the kid, you know. Narrator. This attitude was reflected in how the camps operated. Yes, there were rules. Yes, there was security. But there was also an informality, a surprising humanity that shocked the German POWs. Heinrich Weber remembered. The guards would joke with us, share cigarettes, talk about their families, ask about ours. This was incomprehensible. We'd been told Americans were cold, mechanical, cruel. But here was this guard, this Texan named Billy, showing me pictures of his sweetheart back in Houston, asking if I had a girl waiting for me in Germany. Transition. Vintage Coca-Cola advertisements, bottles being shared. Narrator. If hamburgers represented basic sustenance, Coca-Cola became something more, a symbol of American abundance, optimism, and cultural power. 4 German POWs who had spent years in a nation practicing total war rationing. The availability of Coca-Cola everything was rationed, almost incomprehensible was for the war effort. Schnei, every scrap of food, every resource. And here in a prison camp, they had this sweet drink that served no purpose except pleasure, except enjoyment. The abundance was shocking. It made me question everything I'd been told about America being on the verge of collapse. Narrator. Camp administrators recognized the psychological impact. Coca-Cola, along with other small luxuries, cigarettes, chocolate bars, access to American magazines, became tools of De-Nazification, not through force, but through exposure to a different way of life. The message was subtle but powerful. America had so much abundance, it could afford to give luxuries to its enemies. Germany, despite all its talk of superiority, couldn't even feed its own population. Transition, classroom scenes, books, newspapers. Narrator. But food and drink were just the beginning. The real transformation happened through education, work, and unexpected freedoms. POWs in Texas camps were allowed to attend classes, learn trades, and most importantly, access uncensored information for the first time in their lives. American newspapers, even critical ones, were made available. Movies were shown, Hollywood films that depicted an America entirely different from Nazi propaganda. For the Hitler youth among them, this was cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. Heinrich. I'd been taught that America was a Jewish-controlled, racially impure nation on the verge of moral collapse. That democracy was weakness. That only the strong Führer could lead a nation. And then I'm sitting in a camp in Texas, reading American newspapers that openly criticized President Roosevelt. Politicians arguing with each other. People disagreeing. And the country wasn't collapsing. It was winning the war. Decisively. This broke something in my mind. Narrator. The camps implemented a De-Nazification program, screening POWs for ideological commitment. Hardcore Nazis were separated from the more malleable younger prisoners. The young ones, especially, were given opportunities to engage with American culture, American ideas, and American values. Transition. POWs working in fields, interacting with locals. Narrator. Under Geneva Convention rules, POWs could be put to work, and Texas had plenty of work to offer. With American men overseas fighting, Texas agriculture faced severe labor shortages. German POWs were contracted out to farms, ranches, and even some businesses. This created unexpected interactions. German teenagers found themselves working alongside Texan farmers, picking cotton, harvesting crops, repairing equipment. Language barriers gradually fell. Mutual respect, sometimes even friendship, developed. Klaus. I was assigned to work on a farm outside Austin. The owner, Mr. Henderson, he was this old rancher who'd lost his son at Normandy. I expected him to hate me, to work me until I dropped. Instead, he taught me. Showed me how to fix tractors, how to mend fences. At lunch, his wife would bring us sandwiches and lemonade. We'd sit in the shade, and he'd tell stories about Texas, about his son. I realized he was mourning, And somehow, being kind to me, the enemy, was his way of honoring his son's sacrifice. I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I fully understand it now. Narrator. These interactions humanized both sides. Germans realized Americans were not the monsters they'd been taught to fear. Americans saw that not every German was a committed Nazi. Many were just boys caught up in forces beyond their control. Transition. Letters home. Personal reflections. Narrator. As months passed, the transformation in these young Germans became undeniable. Letters home, censored, but still revealing, showed a dramatic shift in worldview. One young POW wrote to his mother in late 1945, "Mother, nothing is as we were told. The Americans are not our enemies in the way we believed. They are strong, yes, but they are also kind in ways that puzzle me. I am fed better here than I was in the Wehrmacht. I am treated with more respect here than I was by my own officers. I don't know what to think anymore. Perhaps that is good. Perhaps thinking is what I should have done from the beginning." Narrator. The Hamburgers and Coca-Cola weren't just food and drink. They were entry points into questioning everything. If the propaganda had lied about how Americans would treat prisoners, what else had it lied about? If America could be generous to its enemies, what did that say about Nazi claims of American savagery? Heinrich Weber underwent a complete ideological transformation. By the time I left Texas in 1946, I was no longer a Nazi. I'm not sure I ever truly was one. I'd just been a boy swept up in something I didn't understand. But America, strange as it sounds, saved me from that ideology. Not through force, not through punishment, through hamburgers and kindness, and treating me like a human being worth saving. Transition. Newspaper headlines, public debates. Narrator. Not everyone in America was happy about the treatment of German POWs. Some citizens, particularly those who had lost sons, brothers, and fathers in the war, viewed the relatively comfortable conditions as an outrage. Newspaper editorials questioned why enemy prisoners were being fed American beef, while some Americans dealt with rationing. Politicians faced angry constituents demanding harsher treatment. The irony was particularly sharp in the South, where German POWs were sometimes treated better than black Americans. German prisoners could eat in restaurants that barred black soldiers. They could sit in movie theaters, where black Americans were restricted to balconies. This contradiction was not lost on observers, and it became part of the growing civil rights consciousness that would explode in the decades following the war. Narrator. But military leadership defended the approach. General Dwight Eisenhower himself argued that humane treatment of POWs wasn't just about following the Geneva Convention. It was strategic. It encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. It provided valuable intelligence, and it laid groundwork for post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. The treatment of German POWs in Texas and across America became a model for how to win not just a war, but also the peace that followed. Transition. Ships departing. Repatriation scenes. Narrator. Beginning in 1946, German POWs started the long journey home. Many didn't want to leave. They were returning to a Germany that no longer existed, a nation divided, destroyed, starving, and psychologically shattered. Klaus Schneider. Leaving Texas was harder than arriving had been. I was going back to rubble, to chaos, to a country that had lost everything. And I just spent 2 years in a place where there was food, safety, structure, where people had been kind to me even though I'd fought against their country. It felt backwards. Narrator. But these returning POWs brought something valuable home, a different perspective. They had seen democracy work. They had experienced prosperity. They had encountered generosity from their enemies. They became, in many ways, informal ambassadors for democratic values in post-war Germany. Heinrich Weber returned to Hamburg and became a teacher, dedicating his life to ensuring German youth would never again be indoctrinated as he had been. I tell my students about Texas, about the guards who shared cigarettes, about the farmer who taught me engine repair, about the Coca-Cola and hamburgers that made me question everything I'd been taught. I tell them that democracy isn't weakness, that kindness isn't foolishness, that seeing your enemy as human doesn't make you a traitor. It makes you wise. Transition, modern Texas, former campsites, memorial plaques. Narrator, today, most of the Texas POW camps are gone, converted to other uses, reclaimed by the land, remembered only by historical markers and fading photographs. But their impact resonates. The program of humane treatment for POWs became a cornerstone of American military policy. The lessons learned in Texas camps influenced everything from the Marshall Plan to modern counterinsurgency doctrine. The idea that you can defeat an ideology not just through force, but through demonstrating a better alternative, that started, in part, in these dusty Texas camps. Narrator, more immediately, many of the German POWs who spent time in Texas returned to America after the war. Once the occupation ended and restrictions lifted, they immigrated, bringing families, starting businesses, contributing to their former enemies' prosperity. Klaus Schneider returned to America in 1952, settling in Austin, just miles from where he'd been imprisoned. He opened a bakery that became a local institution. People asked me why I came back, why I'd returned to the country I'd fought against, to the place where I'd been a prisoner. And I tell them, Texas saved my life. Not just physically, but spiritually, intellectually. It freed me from hatred, from blind ideology. How could I not come back? Transition, philosophical reflection, modern parallels. Narrator, the story of German child soldiers trembling in Texas prison camps until they were given hamburgers and Coca-Cola sounds almost trivial when reduced to a headline, but it represents something profound about human nature, about power, and about how we choose to treat our enemies. America could have treated these POWs brutally. International law would have allowed much harsher conditions. Public opinion often demanded it. Revenge would have been understandable. But by choosing a different path, America achieved something remarkable. It didn't just imprison enemy soldiers, it converted them, not through torture or brainwashing, but through the radical act of treating them like human beings worth redeeming. Narrator, the hamburger and Coca-Cola were symbols of something larger: abundance over scarcity, generosity over revenge, hope over hatred. They represented a confident America that could afford to be magnanimous because it was winning not just militarily but ideologically. For the young Germans who experienced this, it was transformative. Many became lifelong advocates for democracy, for American-German friendship, for the values they'd been taught to despise, but came to embrace. Transition, contemporary footage, modern conflicts. Narrator, what lessons does this story hold for us today? In an era of renewed polarization, of dehumanizing enemies, of zero-sum thinking about conflict, perhaps it's this: that people, especially young people, are not their ideology. That indoctrination can be reversed. That kindness is not weakness, but strategy. That the most effective way to defeat a dangerous idea is to offer a better one, and then live it out in practice. The German child soldiers who trembled in Texas prison camps learned that democracy wasn't a weakness they'd been taught to despise. They learned it through hamburgers that proved abundance, through Coca-Cola that demonstrated prosperity, through guards who treated them with unexpected humanity, and through a system that allowed criticism of itself without collapsing. They learned, in other words, through living proof. Fade to elderly Klaus at his bakery, modern Austin in background. Klaus, final interview, elderly. I'm 95 years old now. I've lived more of my life in Texas than I ever did in Germany. My children are Americans. My grandchildren are Texans through and through. And it all started with a hamburger and a Coca-Cola in a prison camp in 1945. People talk about winning hearts and minds. That's what America did to us. Not through propaganda, not through force, but through showing us a different way of living. A better way. I was a Nazi child soldier. I was taught to hate. And America responded with a hamburger, a kind word, and a second chance. That's the America I fell in love with. That's the America I chose to call home. If an old German soldier can change, can be redeemed, can find hope after everything, then maybe there's hope for us all.